All right, so are you ready for this? We're going deep on a topic that's, well, it's kind of strange, but also really revealing. Virginity faking in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you don't really think about.
Right, like who was worried about that back then?
You'd be surprised.
I guess so. So let's get into it. What did they do?
Well, I mean, we're talking everything. Leeches, animal blood, potions, you name it.
Wow, that's intense. But why? What was the big deal about appearing virginal?
It all comes down to the power dynamics of the time. You have to understand women were essentially property.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
Right. So first they belonged to their fathers, and then, well, they were transferred to their husbands when they got married.
So not a lot of room for female empowerment there, huh?
No, not really. And in this system, a woman's virginity was like this valuable commodity.
I can see how that would be the case, yeah.
It was the only way to guarantee paternity and therefore legitimate heirs.
Ah, so it's all about inheritance and lineage and social standing.
Ex-
Okay, so that makes sense. Huge pressure to appear virginal on your wedding night. But how did they even determine virginity back then? What did these tests actually involve?
Well, the methods were, how do I put this? Not very scientific.
Right.
Midwives played a key role. They would conduct inspections to assess the hymen.
Ouch.
Yeah,
And then there's the whole bloody sheets expectation after consummation, which, I mean, you can imagine that wasn't exactly foolproof.
right. I don't know.
So, okay, let's say a woman wasn't actually a virgin. What were her options? What could she do?
Well, believe it or not, there were quite a few ways to fake it.
Really?
Yeah. And some of them were pretty remarkable,
I bet.
though maybe not all that comfortable.
Like what
Yeah.
what kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, some women tried to bribe the midwife.
Ah, so just skip the inspection altogether.
Exactly. Clever. Right.
Yeah. But wouldn't that be risky for the midwife too?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Remember, this is a time when societal views of women were very much shaped by, well, patriarchal norms.
Right.
Women were often seen as inherently deceptive.
Mm.
So finding a midwife willing to risk their reputation, that would have been really difficult.
Okay, so bribing's probably out. What else?
How about some blood magic?
Blood magic. Now we're talking. This sounds like something straight out of like a witch's spell book.
It does, doesn't it? But in this case, it involved using leeches.
Leeches. Those slimy blood-sucking creatures. Wait, are you serious?
Oh, yeah. Medieval medical texts, like the Trotula, describe this method in detail. Apparently, women would place leeches on their labia a few days before their wedding night. Let a small wound form and scab over. Then, during consummation, the scab would break, creating the illusion of bleeding.
Wow.
You have to admire the ingenuity, even if it makes you squirm a little.
Yeah. It's definitely creative. Leeches, though, that's hardcore. Were there any options that, didn't involve creepy crawlies?
Of course. If leeches weren't appealing, there was always the option of using animal blood.
Oh, okay. This sounds like something straight out of a movie, like a very low-budget medieval rom-com gone wrong.
Maybe. The idea was to just discreetly spill a vial of animal blood onto the sheets during the wedding night.
Oh my gosh, I can only imagine how stressful that would be. You're trying to be romantic, but also worried about spilling pig's blood at the right moment.
Exactly. Not to mention the potential for things to get.
Messy, for sure. So we've got blood magic, we've got animal blood. What other tricks did these medieval women have up their sleeve?
Well, some women turned to what we might call potion masters for help.
Potion masters. Okay, this is officially sounding like a fantasy novel. Did they brew these potions in cauldrons and chant magic spells?
Well, probably not. These potion masters were skilled in creating concoctions and poultices that would constrict the vaginal opening, so make it seem tighter.
Interesting. And what kind of ingredients did they use?
One popular ingredient was alum water,
Alum water.
which, believe it or not, is also used in tanning leather and pickling food.
Wait, hold on. Something used to pickle things was also used?
Yep. Alum water is an astringent, so it shrinks and tightens tissues. Applying it, shall we say, strategically, could create the illusion of virginity.
Wow, these women were tough. Alum water sounds intense.
It probably was. And there were other concoctions, too, often involving herbs like oak bark and comfrey, all designed to achieve a similar effect.
Okay, so we've got leeches, animal blood, astringent potions. What else? Did they have any, devices back then?
Actually, yes. Medieval women were pretty resourceful when it came to creating internal devices.
Really?
These could be rings made of various materials, resin, even suppositories, all inserted to create resistance.
Wow, internal devices. Talk about going to extremes. And it's kind of funny. It seems like this desire for, let's say, enhancement isn't unique to the 21st century. It's like
Hmm.
that drive has been around for centuries, just expressed in different ways.
Absolutely. But speaking of different ways, there's one more method we should talk about. Vaginal fumigation.
Vaginal fumigation, what in the world is that?
It involved using herbal steam to supposedly repair a ruptured hymen.
Herbal steam, so like a medieval spa treatment gone wrong?
Maybe not wrong, but certainly more extreme than a modern facial scheme. They would heat vessels of water mixed with herbs over an open fire until steam was produced. Then, they would funnel that steam through a tube inserted into the vagina.
Okay, now that sounds both elaborate and terrifying. Did it actually work?
The effectiveness is debatable. But remember, fumigation was a pretty common medical practice in the Middle Ages, so this fits into their broader beliefs about healing and the body. It's also important to remember that for medieval society, the hymen was seen as like this magical barrier, proof of purity and worth. There was even this belief that a bee would only sting a true virgin.
A bee test. That's incredible. I can only imagine the anxiety surrounding a test like that.
Exactly, and it really highlights just how deeply entrenched these beliefs were. But as we've discussed, the hymen itself isn't a reliable indicator of virginity at all. I mean, it can be torn by all sorts of things, not just sex.
Right, like horseback riding or even certain kinds of physical activity, which makes the whole concept of these virginity tests seem even more absurd, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, these tests were rooted in this fundamental lack of scientific understanding
Right.
and driven by this desire to control women's sexuality. They really underscore how cultural beliefs, even when they're based on misinformation, can shape our perceptions of the body and influence social practices.
It's almost like the whole concept of virginity was more about control than anything else.
With precisely. Virginity was a social construct, a tool that was used to regulate women's behavior and enforce compliance within a patriarchal system.
And the lengths they went to, the leeches, the potions, the internal devices, it's a testament to the pressure they faced. It must have been terrifying to live under that kind of scrutiny.
Absolutely. Imagine the desperation, the fear of being exposed, the potential consequences of failing to meet these societal expectations. We're not just talking about bizarre medieval practices. We're looking at the very real struggles of women trying to navigate a system that denied them agency and bodily autonomy.
It's heartbreaking, really. These women were essentially trapped, forced to make impossible choices.
And yet, even within those constraints, they found ways to resist. The fact that they resorted to such extreme measures speaks volumes about their resilience and resourcefulness.
Yeah.
They carved out this sliver of control in a world that sought to dictate every aspect of their lives.
It's almost like a historical example of women taking back their power, even if it meant resorting to, well, leeches and animal blood.
Exactly. And that's what makes this exploration so compelling. It challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about the past and to recognize the lasting legacy of these societal norms.
So we've explored the how and the why of virginity faking in the Middle Ages, but what does it all mean for us today? How do these historical practices inform our understanding of gender dynamics in the present?
That's the crucial question. While we thankfully moved beyond a time when women were literally considered property, it's important to acknowledge that subtle pressures and expectations still exist.
That's true. We may not have virginity tests or leeches, but there are still societal messages that attempt to police women's sexuality and control their bodies.
Absolutely. Think about the double standards that persist. The pressure to conform to certain beauty standards, the shaming and judgment women often face for expressing their sexuality.
It's as if those medieval anxieties about female deception and the need to control women's bodies are still echoing in our culture today, just in different forms.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these historical patterns, to recognize how they continue to shape our perceptions and behaviors.
So what can we do about it? How do we break free from these outdated norms and create a more equitable society?
It starts with awareness. By recognizing the subtle ways in which these historical patterns continue to influence our thinking, we can start to challenge them. We need to question the messages we're bombarded with, push back against double standards, and advocate for a society that values women's autonomy and bodily agency.
And maybe we need to place a little less emphasis on virginity as like the ultimate marker of a woman's worth. I mean, it's a concept that's caused a lot of unnecessary anxiety and suffering throughout history.
I couldn't agree more. It's time to move beyond these outdated constructs and embrace a more holistic view of women's sexuality and identity, one that recognizes their individuality and their right to make choices about their own bodies.
Well said. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's amazing how these seemingly bizarre practices from the past can shed light on contemporary issues and challenge us to examine our own beliefs.
It's a testament to the power of history. By delving into the past, we can gain a deeper understanding of the present and find inspiration to create a more just and equitable future.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more fascinating aspect of this topic we haven't touched on yet. We've talked about like all the societal pressures that these women faced, but what about the personal side of things? Faking your virginity? I mean, that couldn't have been easy emotionally.
Right. I mean, we can only imagine the internal conflict, the anxiety, the fear of being found out. It's a really important point.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about leeches and potions, but to think about the weight of that secret, that's heavy.
Exactly. Imagine having to navigate all these societal expectations while also grappling with your own desires and choices. And the potential shame and isolation if you're discovered, that must have been incredibly difficult.
It really humanizes these historical figures, doesn't it? It's like they weren't just following some script. They were real people making incredibly tough decisions in a world that didn't really give them a lot of options.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole topic so powerful. It forces us to look beyond just the surface level of these historical events and recognize, the complex lives and struggles of the people who actually lived through them.
As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of admiration for these medieval women. Their ingenuity, their resilience, their determination to exert some control over their lives. It's pretty inspiring.
I agree. It's a reminder that even when you're facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles, people find ways to carve out their own paths and make their own choices.
Well said. And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive into the world of medieval virginity faking has not only been entertaining, but also thought-provoking.
We encourage you to keep exploring these themes: societal control, agency, and the evolution of gender dynamics. After all, history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world and continue to influence us today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the endlessly fascinating tapestry of human history.